Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. There are over 800 of you registered for today's webinar from over 100 different countries. So thank you all for joining. We are so excited to have you here with us today. Today's webinar is being hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. IAIA is the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment for making better and more informed decisions. My name is Keisha Blaser. I work with the IAIA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar, though you'll mostly be hearing from our speakers and moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment. On the screen there, we have our Twitter or X handle. So if you hear something today in the webinar that you would like to share on social media, please feel free to do so. There's also a hashtag there, hashtag IAIA webinar, that you could use if you're posting on LinkedIn, Facebook, or another social site as well. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point you to our website, IAIA.org, to check out all the resources and upcoming events we have there. So first off, you'll find a variety of on-demand webinars like today's webinar that you can watch, as well as the slides and any other handouts that the presenters provided. So there's just a couple on the screen there: human rights, due diligence, and the environment, and one of our digital IA sessions on keeping the human in the loop, which was a specific webinar showcasing an AI tool for ENS management. But there are a variety of different webinars covering topics like biodiversity, resettlement, impact assessment finance, and more. So do please check that out. Next, I'd like to also mention that on our website, you can find information about our upcoming events. So specifically, we have our annual conference, IAIA 25, happening in Bologna, Italy. The theme for this year's conference is Impact Assessment in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and that's taking place the 1st through 4th of May, and registration is open now and will close in mid-April. In addition to the main conference, which will have over 100 different sessions on a variety of topics. So even if you are not focused on AI in your work, no matter what your sector is, there's something for you. But in addition to those sessions, there are also training courses before the conference starts and technical visits before and after as well. So there's a variety of different activities and events to get involved in. So please go check that out on our website. Additionally, another upcoming event we have is a theme forum on climate adaptation in megacities, insights learned in Hong Kong that can be applied for all cities. So this has been a series going on for the past 5 weeks, where we've had live or on-demand recordings going out each week on Wednesdays. So you can head to our website and watch all the recordings. And then next week, on the 27th of November, we'll have the live Q&A, where you can hear from speakers and get all of your burning questions answered. In addition to all of those, we also have some online training and mentorship available through our professional development program. We have 2 courses in this program: our Foundations of Impact Assessment course, which has been going on for a few years, and our newest program, the Social Impact Assessment course, which just started this past June. Registration opened just today for both of those courses, so there's plenty of spots available in each one, but they will sell out fast. So if you are interested, please go check those out and get registered today. Now, finally, there are also a variety of free downloadable publications like our best practice principles, IA fast tips, and more. So again, that's at www.iaia.org. Now, before we get started, I have a few pieces of housekeeping to cover. So first off, for those of you that are interested, I know that you're coming from, like I said, over 100 different countries, which is plenty of different time zones. So today's webinar will be recorded if you have to leave early or if you're not able to join us live. So the webinar, the recording will be sent to you via email within a couple of days and will also be available on our website to view. In addition, you will have the Q&A at the end of this webinar for about 25 minutes, but don't feel like you have to wait till the end to ask your questions. So if you navigate to the Questions tab on your control panel, you can type in your questions there and our presenters will flag it for the Q&A. I will mention, like I said, we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for the Q&A. So if you don't have time to get your question answered, you can also go to the Handouts tab on the control panel, and there's a contact information sheet for each of the presenters that has their name and a brief bio plus their email address, so you can contact them directly with your questions. And then finally, the slides for today's webinar are also available in that Handouts tab and will be included in the recording as well. So now I would like to introduce today's webinar moderator, Will Rifkin, who is a sociologist and applied regional economist with the University of Newcastle, Australia. He has spent years developing and implementing methods to foster more widespread understanding of social and economic impacts and to guide local and regional change. Applications include impacts on communities from development of natural gas resources in rural Queensland, resistance to development of waste-to-energy facilities in suburban Sydney, and community transitions from the approaching closure of coal mines and power stations in rural Australia. So with that, Will, over to you.
All right, thank you. Are you wondering how to report on the growing stress evident in a community near a proposed mine, roadway, or redevelopment area? Or are you aware of historical injustices that lead to distrust, concerns about fairness, and a sense of powerlessness among some in a community? Are you not sure of the most effective way to characterize and include these elements in an impact assessment? If you answered yes, then you're in the right place today. These sorts of effects are captured by psychosocial impact assessment, PSIA. The field's history goes back decades. Its approaches and findings have been receiving growing interest in recent years in relation to rights of First Nations peoples and heightened sensitivity to cumulative impacts and social license. There's also increasing acknowledgement of the importance of individual and community mental health. When you registered, we asked what you're looking for in this webinar, what you would like to learn, and this is what you said. Understanding the basics of PSIA, methods and tools for identifying, measuring, and evaluating psychosocial impacts, integration of PSIA into environmental and social impact assessments, addressing historical injustices and community distrust in impact assessments, psychosocial impacts on Indigenous communities and traditional populations, mitigation measures and management of psychosocial impacts, psychosocial impacts in specific settings such as mining, climate change, or in the workplace, and best practices and emerging trends in PSIA. We asked you how familiar you were with PSIA, and 2/3 of you are saying that you have very little knowledge or only somewhat familiar with PSIA. On the other hand, about 10% of you are quite familiar or very familiar with the topic. And as Keisha noted, you come from more than 100 countries, which suggests widely different settings. This webinar will cover basics of the field and how PSIA can strengthen social and health impact assessment by Sergio Moreira. Then godfather of the field, Mike Edelstein, provides historical examples of psychosocial impacts and PSIA. That's followed by an introduction by Helen Ross on how PSIA can identify and characterize cultural impacts. Jeffrey Jacquet then discusses briefly the complexity and causes and vicious cycles emerging in relation to psychosocial impacts. Then Sergio returns to question where the field is heading and its implications for pressures to streamline impact assessment. That's followed by question and answer. And the question and answer session will run for whatever time remains in the 90 minutes. The first cab off the rank is Sergio Moreira, a social psychologist working in social performance and project community relations in development-induced projects. He has experience in large-scale projects in the energy, transportation, and extractive sectors. Currently, he's a senior consultant at Community Insights Group and an invited lecturer at Católica Lisbon School and Nova School of Business and Economics.
Hello all, it's a delight to be here. And yeah, it's good to be in touch with IAIA audience and with all the audience that is joining this webinar. Welcome all. Hope we can provide some answers to the questions you've posed when you apply to come to this webinar. So yeah, a very quick introduction to this working group. It's a working group of a community that's got together through IAIA almost 5 years, about 5 years ago during the pandemic, during the remote IAIA conference. We had a first encounter there, and from there we keep working together. I would say with two objectives. The first objective is to create a cohesive narrative around what is psychosocial impact assessments, why it matters, how it can be applied effectively, And the second reason is, it's to raise awareness among practitioners that are already doing psychosocial impact assessment, but maybe they lack a name, they lack a community, a group of people that have been working on this realm, to raise awareness among those that face some challenges, but they don't know how to answer to those challenges, and psychosocial impact assessment might provide an answer to that. Here are some of the members of the group: Will, Jeffrey, Catherine, we have Wari, we have Alan Ross, myself, and Michael Idelstein, just to give some of the names in this picture. Next slide, please, Keisha. So these are some of the initiatives that we've been involved in. So we met in 2021, 2022. We had a workshop at IAIA. At 2023, we have published a fast tip on psychosocial impact assessment. Was the first fruit that was bared by this group. And then in 2024, we've been together again, and in 2023 we've been together in Malaysia. 2024 we've been also present in Dublin, and now this psychosocial impact assessment, and there is much more to come in the future. Keisha, you can move to the next slide. And next slide again. So what is psychosocial impact assessment? There are a few definitions already out there that you can look at. There is this definition from the FAST tips. It's a subset of social impacts arising from projects that specially relate to the mental health, psychological well-being, and emotions of people. Next slide, Keisha. There is a definition that came recently in the social impact assessment Handbook of Social Impact Assessment and Management, in a chapter written by Michael and Frank. Impacts, psychosocial impact assessments is impacts in how people experience their world, their patterns of daily activities, as well as their mental health. This comes from Michael Adelstein theory on psychosocial impact assessment. And if we take it all together, these definitions and others that have been published in the field, we kind of come to the understanding that psychosocial impact assessment has all to do with the human experience of impacts of the changes that are brought by projects. Keisha, we can move next slide again. So one of the critical challenges of psychosocial impact assessment is how can psychosocial impact assessment fit within the IA practice? This actually has been one of the main, challenges, critiques, tasks is to come up with a way of integrating, yet maybe another area of impact assessment with other already with a field that it's already crowded. Keisha, you can move next slides. So we have social impact assessment, we have gender-based impact assessment, we have health impact assessments, we have, harmonized impact assessment. There's many different lenses, ways of looking at the impact assessment field. So our answer to this is, considering psychosocial impact assessment as a transversal element, looking at the human experience as a transversal element. We'll show you this in the next slide. Keisha, can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So social impact assessments can be seen as layered. We have social impact assessments. Next slide. We have health impact assessments. Next slide. We can have human rights impacts. Next slide. And we can have gender-based impacts, and we can keep going on and on and on. So psychosocial impacts is transversal to these different elements because it allows to characterize the human experience, wherever we're talking about social, health, human rights, gender, or whatever is the realm of the impact assessment that we're working on. So, next slide again, Keisha. So the important point here is that, this characterization of the human experience helps us to get a deeper understanding of impacts. And there's different specific literatures, methodologies, frameworks that psychosocial impact assessment relies on to help deepen the understanding of impacts. So mental health, community perceptions, how beliefs are built and how beliefs are held, trust and fairness, acceptance, conflict and contestation, and on and on. So these are the few examples of ways we can deepen our understanding about impacts. Just to give you a quick example, imagine if we're talking about health impact assessments, if we're talking about, imagine issues that have to do respiratory diseases that might be a consequence of a project. These respiratory diseases might have an impact as well on mental well-being. People might feel more anxious, more stressed, maybe even more depressed. So that's where this lens of psychosocial impact assessment can come in to understand this layered, this feedback loop of health impacts of a project, giving rise to psychological impacts, which in turn can actually give rise to other sort of impacts, maybe increase in contestation, increase in conflict, lack of project support, and on and on and on. So to close, just to say that psychosocial impact assessment is not only a matter of deepening the understanding about impacts, but it also has this side effects of helping, assisting in the development of plans that are associated with projects. The ground for a good psychosocial impact assessment often involves setting the stage for stakeholder engagements. It starts with consultation, and psychosocial impact assessment, the type of references that are used to understand the human experience, it's very easy to, based on that understanding, to prepare things like community agreement, to work towards community agreement plans, to work towards livelihood and restoration plans, just to give a few examples. This is it on my side. Keisha, next slides. And Will, back to you.
Great, thank you. Now we'll hear from Michael Edelstein, Emeritus Professor at Ramapo State University. He's an environmental psychologist renowned for his pioneering research and advocacy on behalf of communities who have suffered toxic exposure, from Hawaii to Canada to Russia. He's written the standard work on PSIA, Contaminated Communities, and many other publications. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with the group that I've been working with on psychosocial impact assessment, and to meet so many more of you from all across the world. Next slide, please. So I was asked to talk about psychosocial impact assessment and its origins from my own perspective. And on the left, these are just some of the projects I did in about a 12-year period from the end of the 1970s through the 1990s. And there are very different kinds of projects. Some of them involved the impacts of hazardous facilities, toxic disasters, environmental injustices, industrial accidents, nuclear accidents, oil spill, the effects of a Superfund site or a site that's under hazardous waste cleanup. And at the same time, others have to do with project proposals and doing essentially part of the environmental review that goes into them. And those are primarily hazardous facilities, high-level nuclear waste sites, hazardous chemical sites, things like that. So there are a whole mix of facilities here. And I draw a number of lessons from these. I'm having to move quickly. I'd love to talk about each of these. But the lessons I think are important. First of all, one can make a distinction in psychosocial impact assessment between two kinds of applications. One is proactive, where one is doing essentially a part of an impact assessment on a proposed project. In the United States, it would be through the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or a State Environmental Policy Act. It would be through some type of permit hearing. And in contrast to that, we have reactive impact assessment, where a disaster or some other type of event has happened and exposures have occurred to whatever kind of impacts there are. And we're looking at what those mean for the people that are affected. In all of these situations, process becomes as important in many respects as the impact itself. We'll see that in an example that I'll give. But whether you're talking about the process of decision making and whether people's concerns are being able to be heard in that process, or whether one is talking about how a cleanup occurs or what kind of help arrives after some kind of an event, those are all process impacts. I'm very keen on thinking about the generalizability between projects and cases, which I certainly thought about with all of this work. And what I realized was that there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarity between them, even between proactive and reactive situations. And that means that it's ripe for the development of theory. And of course, theory is all about the ability to create generalization. And that allows you to move quickly into understanding what's happening in a given community. I also realized that there are many instances of injustice, and that oftentimes what I call perpetual jeopardy occurs, where the subject of injustice is continually exposed to new objects of hazard. Psychosocial impact assessment, I've discovered the hard way, is difficult for decision makers to consider. Many times they've in the past had trouble bringing this into weighing the factors that lead to a decision about a project. And as a result, there have been historically relatively few experts who've worked in this area. That's beginning to change, and I'm very happy about that. Another realization is that whether you're talking about Superfund, the idea of remediation, the idea of cleanup, the idea of mitigation, all of these things also have impacts. And so the solutions we bring to one set of problems cause another set of issues. And that leads me to one of my key rules that I've developed, which is it's very easy to pollute, but it's virtually impossible to decontaminate. Next slide, please. So what kind of theory emerges from this? Well, in 1984, I had a chance to work with Charlie Wolf's Center for Social Impact Assessment on a high-level nuclear waste assessment for a project in Mississippi in the Richton Dome, which was being considered as a high-level nuclear waste site for the United States. And each of the experts who were brought in on this had to develop a theoretical model to share with everyone. And what I came up with in thinking about psychosocial impact assessment was what I call social process and eco-historical context. On the left side of the pyramid, we have a continuum. At the bottom, we have individuals, the most private spheres, the family, the most local spheres, the neighborhood, the community. And as we move up the continuum through various institutional filters, we come to a societal level of impact, very public, dealing with the commons, highly global in many cases. And that continuum is an extremely important frame to think about what is the target of psychosocial impact assessment. As a psychologist, I'm likely to think about individuals or families or small groups. But in fact, psychosocial impacts occur all along this continuum. So there are impacts at all levels of social process. The levels, moreover, are nested. They're interactive, they're interdependent. And dynamics at any one level will influence all the other levels. Let me just also say, go back 1 second. The social process always occurs in an eco-historical context. And that eco-historical context consists of the environmental conditions in which the community or the people involved find themselves in or fear becoming part of, and also the historical context that they have, which in their perception makes a great difference in terms of how they see events that evolve. Next slide, please. So this leads to the theory of environmental turbulence. And environmental turbulence affects three sectors of the person or the other object of social process. Those have to do with their cognition, or what I call the lifescape, the assumptions they make about everyday life that underpin in how they live, and which with environmental turbulence are subject to change. Second of all, there's the issue of lifestyle, the case of behavior. How do people go through the course of their everyday lives? What are the activities that spur them forward? Oftentimes, these are challenged by environmental turbulence. And then there's the issue of life strain. Life strain involves stress and coping. Are people resilient? Are they able to address the kind of issues they confront? Next slide, please. So if we look at the lifescape, we see that with environmental turbulence, there's frequently an altered understanding of daily life. And that affects core areas of the lifescape. One of them has to do with our bodies and whether we see ourselves as healthy. Frequently, there's a shift, depending on the event, to beginning to doubt whether, in fact, we are healthy or whether we may have health challenges in the future. There's the issue of the self and whether we feel in control of the issues that we confront in daily life. Oftentimes, the issues that happen wrest control from the person. There's the issue of home and whether we feel secure there, of the environment, whether we feel safe there. And then there's the issue of social trust. Is our social network trustworthy? Do we trust government? Do we trust industry? Do we trust others who affect what's happening with our lives? There can be other factors in lifescape as well. For example, livelihood frequently is involved. But the key issue here is that these core areas of normal life go through fundamental lifescape shifts once environmental turbulence occurs. Next slide, please. So then we have the issue of lifestyle, adjustments and adaptations to normal activity patterns. And on one hand, we have direct impacts from whatever kind of situation people find themselves in. The slide on the left shows a municipal landfill in Jackson Township, New Jersey, and the issues that residents around the landfill confronted in the course of their daily lives. For example, if you have horrible odors, opening your windows or going outside becomes a problem. You try not to do those things as much. So what kinds of changed behaviors occur? On the right side, we see the people who are forced to adjust daily life to new conditions. They often have to alter their habits. They feel a loss of normalcy. For example, if your water is polluted, you may not be able to drink it, cook with it, wash with it, clean the house with it. So that dramatically alters your behavior. You may have limited access to your home and property. If the soil's contaminated, you worry about dust being brought into the house or having your children go out and play in the yard. You may have to wear a pollution mask, something we all got a taste of with the COVID situation. And this is something that may happen in communities. Then there's the issue of all the time that's spent dealing with the crisis. These things become very time consuming, and a lot of that time is spent in situations that are very stressful. And then there are changes driven by ill health. As our health starts to deteriorate, we change what we do. And all these changes have meaning. Are they temporary or are they permanent? Are they voluntary or are they forced on you? Next slide, please. Life strain involves the amount of stress in a situation and whether or not the affected parties have the coping resources to deal with it. So on the left, we see some common coping challenges. For example, there's the challenge of even understanding and accepting that one is at risk in a particular situation. This is a matter of perception. There's a shift once one accepts that turbulence to a perpetual abnormality. And there's lots of stress and coping impacts that go along with this. And there's a question of whether those impacts exceed the coping resources that the responding entity has, whether it's an individual, an organization, a community. There's a new reality that exists, a kind of culture shock sets in, and there's changes to the psychological well-being of those involved. There may be anticipatory fears, what has been exposed to that may affect me in the future. And various types of psychological and social dysfunction may occur in terms of how people respond to each other or their ability to cope with the situation they find themselves in. And people are affected both by whatever exposure occurs, whatever impact, but also the response that others and society has to that situation affects them as well. On the right, we have changed relational dynamics. Oftentimes people find their relational network is inadequate. They become reliant on experts because their own judgment isn't relevant because they don't know about the situation. This is disabling. They may be affected by environmental stigma where others look down upon them now and they may look down upon themselves. There may be, on the other side, enabling responses that allow them to be more effective. Oftentimes people gather together and act as a community and have strength from numbers. People may be forced into new roles and actions that may be good or bad, or both. There may be community conflict because people's interests diverge around whatever the issue is. Oftentimes people realize that outsiders to the situation don't understand their situation. Of course, there may be lots of environmental injustice, and in many situations, no matter who's involved, they feel that it's unjust. And people are caught in limbo. There's a great deal of uncertainty, no matter what happens. Next slide, please. All these things happen over life cycles. So if we're looking, for example, at elders, it's different than if we're looking at children, etc. So it's just a quick point. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a case study very briefly. It's a tiny chunk of a case study of the Asarco copper smelter that used to exist in Ruston and Tacoma, Washington. It was there for almost 100 years from the 1880s to 1985. It was a major source of local employment. Besides producing copper, it was a dominant arsenic production for a time in the United States, producing treated lumber and arsenic for pesticides. The chimney was built there, a 573-foot tall one, in 1918 to disperse the effluents to avoid local complaints. But you still had a polluted air coming down on the community with sulfur dioxide and arsenic and spreading over 1,000 square mile area of the Puget Sound because of the height of the chimney, where soils became polluted with arsenic and lead and other heavy metals. Next, please. This is a picture of the community. Next, please. So in the mid-1990s, the Environmental Protection Agency required Asarco to start a Superfund cleanup in the worst areas. A 1 square mile area was designated. I was brought in to study the psychosocial impacts of living in that Superfund site for litigation that occurred on behalf of residents there. I did a field study in 1994, in June and July. I lived in the community for 2 weeks. I interviewed many residents, businesses, officials, and I wrote a 100-page summary of my results, which I'm going to summarize very succinctly. Next, please. I really can't spend a lot of time on this, but there are a whole set of findings here. I drew 13 major findings. Sense of uncertainty, the prior experience people had in the community influenced their perception of being in a contaminated site, whether they had supported and worked at the smelter or whether they had opposed it and thought it was a hazard. There was lots of environmental stigma. The designated area became downgraded. There were lots of life strain and stress and coping and disruptive issues, lots of anticipatory fear, lots of lifestyle impacts. People had to take precautions because they understood that soil in their yards and then their properties was contaminated. Could they be exposed to it? Could they allow their children to be exposed to it? There were adverse impacts once cleanup started. And of course, all of this affected lifescape, people's sense of their health, their loss of control in the situation, their loss of their feelings about their homes and their fear of the environment, and a great distrust of government and industry, and sometimes others, because of the situation they found themselves in. Next slide, please. I'm not going to unpack these because of time, but this is just two examples of the findings. With regard to uncertainty, I'll just read you a couple quotes. Until I get hard evidence as to the risks for my daughter, I don't feel comfortable letting her play around in the dirt. And the issue of distrust. The fact that the State Department of Environment has safe levels that are considerably less than what the Environmental Protection Agency said was safe causes us to question whether EPA was really looking out for our interests. So let me conclude with the next slide. So my work demonstrates that psychosocial impact assessment can be used in lots of different situations. It can be used to develop generalizable theory. And based on that, not only from my work, but from the work of a substantial number of others, we have a considerable literature that has been created that is largely convergent and bolsters the theory. And there's a possibility through PSIA to test, refine, and extend theory. And all of that gives you greater power to talk about what the potential impacts of a given situation may be, or to quickly understand what the impacts are of a situation that has happened that you have to respond to. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. For those who are interested in the download of the PowerPoints for today, there's a lot more information on the 13 key findings from Mike's ASARCO case study. Up next is Helen Ross, Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland. She's an environmental psychologist whose work decades ago inspired and informed a number of people now working in the field of psychosocial impact assessment. Her social impact assessments with Australia's Indigenous communities identified histories of psychosocial impacts. She found that today's psychosocial impacts of mining built on eras of dispossession from land, imposed grazing of cattle on traditional lands, and other upheavals. She's a fellow and honorary life member of IAIA, 2013 winner of the Simon Molesworth Prize, and was co-editor of the Australasian Journal of Environmental Management from 2005 to 2023. Over to you.
Thanks, Will, and hi, everybody. I'm talking to you today from Jagera, a Turrbal country in Meanjin, which is the Aboriginal name for Brisbane, Australia. I've got a simple but profound proposition for you today, which is to pay attention to culture. I was about to say understand culture, but that is a very big ask in cultures that are very different to your own and are not simple to understand. But my work shows, and that of very many people, that the nature of the culture, who people are, how their culture works, the belief system, the value system that goes with that, can be highly important in psychosocial impact assessments, particularly when there is a proposal or an actuality to disturb that physical, what we would call a physical environment. A lot of Indigenous people would call it all relational, it's all one, we are it, it is we, and we have a huge responsibility for it. But where major disturbance is proposed or begins to happen, that sets in train very major psychosocial impact assessments. So hold that thought, and while you're doing that, think about Mike's pyramid there. Next slide, please, Keisha. I'm going to give you two very, very brief case studies, both ones long ago, but ones I've been closely associated with and were good illustrations. And thanks to the people who asked on registration, yes, I'll talk about methods for you. So the Warman community, see the star on the map there is in the East Kimberley. I first became involved with them in 1980 to 81 when I was doing my PhD in a related community down the road, and often visited Warman with their relatives. And then I studied with them for 4 years, managing a large project. The state government, on proposal of the Argyle Diamond Mine, refused to have a social impact assessment. So the community campaigned to get funds to have someone run it, and the Australian National University and some partners did. I was the project officer for that 4-year study, and within it did the close social impact assessment that the community wanted. So the community had campaigned and asked to get a major social impact study, and then we had this finessed one within it. Mine with them was a community controlled study, an interesting story in itself, how that worked. They chose the method of oral histories, and they in effect said, we don't start here, we've got to go back more than a century to before whitefellas came, and they went through waves of cumulative impacts and how they'd responded and reorganized each time. And so they were saying, okay, well, the Argyle to today, which they first discovered the exploration in 1978, certainly weren't consulted, builds on that history, and who we are today builds on that history. So they said, put this in the context of cumulative impacts. Brilliant. Now, jumping to what was happening, principally from my detailed study with them, but I was able to visit again last year, and of course have followed with interest through the years. Most Aboriginal Australian societies have very, very profound beliefs about people's connection with and responsibility for nature. And they're responsible for who comes on their land, invited or otherwise. And therefore they felt very responsible as well for what happened both to the land and to the people. And this caused huge disturbance. Any death or accident at the mine was also interpreted as being spiritual retribution for this mountain range being mined. And you can see how heavily it's mined there. This was a women's dreaming site to do with barramundi dreaming, and the barramundi's eggs were these little diamonds. And but the whole community was behind it. Overall, initially there was huge distress and outrage at the discovery of the exploration. Of course, they weren't consulted. A brief sense of powerlessness. One family that lived closest to it actually hived off, accepted some compensation from the mine because they felt it's hopeless, we can't resist this, so we will take some very generous funding to set up our outstation, which they wanted to do. The rest of the community absolutely fought it and did develop a pretty good sense of empowerment through it. And they, despite being very fearful of the supernatural retributions and seeing it all the time and saying a big flood's going to come eventually, they did take pride in their collective action, and constantly in talking to me and my close collaborator from the community, Jumana, Arlene Bray, they were also feeling quite empowered by their small wins. But overall, between that one family which exceeded and everybody else who fought and fought and fought for many, many years, it was a big rift. It was a dominating issue in the community, really took up their energies, distracted them. So very, very complex. And going back to the community on invitation last year, I found still signs of grieving 2 generations on, but also incorporation. Next slide, please, Keisha. I'll go more briefly into another case for time, sorry. Coronation Hill was a mining proposal, a big national inquiry because it had become so controversial after the EIA basically hadn't heeded Aboriginal interests, and they'd come back with a brilliant rejoinder in public participation, highlighting the cultural meaning of this men's site. It had been mined in the 1950s, but the Aboriginal people didn't feel that relevant. The community was highly split between those who were still very culturally embedded and believed in the divine retribution and the absolute horror of desecrating this site, to the point where elder men were suffering dysfunction, drinking, but also rallying as well. Other generations more interested in employment, women wanting their sons to have employment and stop being social nuisances, stay away from the alcohol. So you see a big backdrop of social ills. The method we used was called strategic perspectives analysis, where with Alan Dale and Marcus Lane, we went through and interviewed little subgroups according to their perspectives and their values on the proposed mine. Simultaneously through the inquiry, there was an anthropological study. There were about 11 studies in all, including the ecological ones. And both the anthropological study and ours affirmed the very, very strong cultural meaning of this site. And ours brought out the social and psychosocial impacts. End story, mine did not go ahead. National interest, concern, outrage over that was tied up with some national politics. But the Jawoyn people were extremely clever. The middle-aged and younger elders said, right, we didn't want that mine. Doesn't mean we're against all mining. Doesn't mean we're against economic development. And they were super organised to blatantly accept a different mine that was treating them better, and absolutely built up Nitmiluk, Catherine Gorge National Park. They've got culturally based employment, enterprises throughout the region. They went through a huge healing process among the people who'd been fractured by the mine proposal. So in the end, it was a pretty good story, but the psychosocial impacts, the pain, the social disruption, the hurt deep inside individuals was horrific. I will end there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yep, thank you, Helen. Next up is Dr. Jeffrey Jacquet, an associate professor in rural and natural resource sociology at Ohio State University. He has a focus on energy development, such as the boom and bust cycles and social impacts from the development of coal, oil, natural gas, and renewables. Other focus areas include rural community development, social impact assessment, and the social psychology of environmental change. He's co-leader of a global network of social scientists investigating community transitions when coal mines and power stations close. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Will. And maybe next slide, please. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. And for this really short presentation, just wanted to sort of plumb a little bit more of the depths between what is psycho and what is social, and sort of the relationship between these two. Basically what Michael Edelstein had talked about, except dumbed down to, you know, a much lower level for the rest of us here. And so are what we're talking about here with these impacts, are they psychosocial, or are they actually social psychological, or sort of what's the difference between these terminologies? And this is a question that I started wrestling with maybe 15 years ago now, sort of analyzing the shale boom in the United States and these disruptions to sort of place identity and sense of place and place meanings and place attachment. And this whole idea of place is sort of like a blend between psychological cognitions and social factors, and that's sort of really what got me in social processes, and that's really what sort of got me interested in this. And so the question is this psychosocial or social psychological? Next slide, please. The answer is yes. It's sort of both. And just thinking about psychosocial here as these sort of psychological factors or psychological impacts from a development, from a proposal, from the types of things that we're used to talking about as impact assessors, leads to these social outcomes. Whereas social psychological tends to be more of the reverse, where it's these social factors that lead to psychological outcomes. And I think in reality, when we look at a lot of these cases, it's very much a blend of all of this together. Next slide, please. And so just, thinking about psychological factors that might lead to social outcomes. So if you have a proposal or a development in a community that may lead to these psychological impacts, such as a perception of a loss of culture, or that their culture is under threat or under risk. There's a fear of the unknown, uncertainty. This can cause increased stress, worry, and which could also, by the way, lead to all sorts of other health outcomes. And then, so these sort of psychological factors could lead to social impacts, such as social conflict and distrust between different groups, and sort of disrupted relationships. Maybe some of these relationships are very long-standing in the community, and now that they are disrupted, that may in fact circle back to cause more worry and more stress. And maybe it ends up causing increased substance abuse, for example. Next slide, please. And on the flip side, thinking about social psychological, you might have a development or a proposal or some sort of construction project which leads to new people in town, increased sort of conflict between groups in the community. Maybe there's inflation, increased prices, the economic factors in the community aren't what they have been. And these are all social factors, social interaction between people, but these social factors might lead to psychological outcomes, such as disrupted identities and people feeling like they don't have the same sort of status in the community or the same place in the community. Maybe there's a loss of trust. Maybe there's increased stress. And so these sort of psychological outcomes that could come from that. Next slide, please. And just to make it a little more complicated, so you might have sort of what I was alluding to earlier, impact or development, a construction project might lead to these social factors, which might lead to these psychological factors, which might then circle back and lead to more social outcomes. And so you can sort of see how it really is this sort of iterative, nested problem. Next slide, please. And so I just want to give one example here that back one. There we go. Thank you. One example here at sort of dealing with in the United States, which is we're seeing a large amount of wind energy projects being cited in the United States, and a lot of them are controversial. A lot of them are leading to a lot of social opposition. I think a lot of wind energy developers see community opposition as the largest sort of hurdle that they face in developing wind energy. It's not necessarily the wind, it's not the transmission lines per se, it's not these factors. The biggest sort of hurdle they're facing, a lot of them will tell you, is sort of social opposition. And so if you have a wind farm that is being proposed, you may have these social factors, social processes going on, such as conflict over the siting process. There may be misinformation or even disinformation being spread, via Facebook, other types of sort of social forums. There may be unjust outcomes or the perception of unjust outcomes. Who is benefiting, who is being impacted unfairly, perhaps, from this development. And so that might lead to these psychological factors. People feeling like their community is no longer the same place that it used to be, that's no longer a community that's a good place to live anymore. They might feel hopeless, helpless. They might feel like they don't have control over their lives anymore. They feel like there's this external stimulus that they can't control. There may be stress, there may be worry. And there's a number of studies that have sort of shown this. I think there's a lot of research out there that shows that wind farms or wind turbines cannot actually physically cause any sort of, physiological impacts to people's health. However, the worry, the stress over getting sick, the worry and stress over sort of unjustly bearing a lot of burdens that other people might be actually benefiting from, these types of things can cause sort of health impacts just due to the stress and worry, which in turn can cause more social outcomes. Maybe they block future development. Maybe there's more wind farm proposals down the line, and those wind farm proposals don't go through due to the sort of this combination of social and psychological factors. Last slide, please. And so the takeaway is just, sort of running through this combination of physical, social, psychological factors that PSIA sort of looks at all of these combined, and it's, I think, in reality, very interdependent and very complex interactions between all these things. However, from a PSIA assessor standpoint, it sort of doesn't necessarily matter where you begin in terms of analyzing these impacts and seeing where these impacts are flowing from and what they are sort of flowing to, and seeing how they interact. Every context is going to be different. Every case study is going to be different in terms of the range of impacts involved. And I think really the message behind, or the importance of PSIA is that you're examining these issues and you're examining the sort of interplay between these processes in ways that maybe traditional SIA it possibly could be overlooking. Back to you, Will.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Now we go back to Sergio Moreira to discuss where PSIA seems to be heading in relation to recent trends relevant to social and health impact assessment. So over to you.
Hello all. Yeah, so after these different contributions, which I think they set a clear stage for the fact that we are a heterogeneous group, but at the same time, we have a similar language. We have different backgrounds, we have different experience with projects, but we are doing very similar things. The way we are using the psychosocial literature frameworks, methodologies, it's very similar. And it became clear to us that there is a way forward with this. Part of it has to do with making this field accessible to more people, giving it a kind of a framework for people to understand its contours and to come in, go away, search other inspirations. So what does this say about the future of psychosocial impact assessment? This is just a reflection. Keisha, can you move forward, please? Yeah. So just three elements that for me seem very clear. One has to do with streamlining, and this is where I want to spend more time on this slide talking about. It's a critical element of impact assessment. Climate change is coming. Projects, infrastructure projects, mining projects are required to tackle this challenge. And how can we move fast the impact assessments process? And from our experience, this really depends on early engagement. Streamlining really depends on changing the conversation from acceptance to partnership. Communities need to become parts of the decision process. It needs to move the language from, impacts and changing the communities to mutual change, to projects, project staff, companies. Requires mutual change. These elements need to change as well as livelihoods, social identity, social relation, social dynamics that change due to a project. And it also requires streamlining. It also requires, from my understanding, intimacy, a close relationship, intimate relationship with communities, which is complex. Intimacy is complex, requires to handle conflict, requires to handle delusion, requires to handle all sort of things that come up with having close relationships. But this is the only way forward. Is not putting the communities in the box and moving forward with the projects because it's too complicated to deal. It's the other way around. Let's open the box as soon as possible, as fast as possible, and let's partner up. So this is one of the things that I really think that the language that comes from psychosocial literature can help, assist, and kind of cast a light on this issue. So related to this is, I believe that the conversation around psychosocial impact assessment, it's also feeding into a larger conversation of dealing with community project relations. This is the lens I believe that it's really, really important to bring forward. The idea that it is a relationship of parts, community projects, staff, people, and we need to understand the interpersonal, intergroup relationships, and to kind of grant that we have better decisions, have more sustainable projects. Yeah, this is another part. I'm a psychologist by training, so I believe that the future, few years from now, maybe you still talk about psychosocial impact assessment as part of the history, but I believe that the conversation will be about psychology-informed impact assessment. Again, it's broadening up a little bit. It's not just about the impact assessment process, but it's also about how psychology can inform other elements. Teams working, the challenges that teams face, and how organizational psychology can talk to that, how community psychology can talk to specific issues. So this is where I think that the field is heading in the future. Next slide, Keisha, just to close. Where will this group be in the future? Next year, there is a session that it will be led by Alan Ross. Few communications from people in the group. There is a psychology-informed impact assessment training that precedes the IAIA conference in Bologna. So looking forward to see you there as well. There is a chapter for the health impact assessment handbook that's the group is co-authoring. That is in preparation. There is a paper on psychosocial impact assessment. There is in preparation as well. And there is a handbook in community project relations that it's very early starts, but I do have great aspirations for the impact that it will have in terms of helping the practice. Yeah, well, this is it for now on my side. The floor is yours again.
Great, thank you, Sergio. So as you've just heard, psychosocial impacts reflect the lived experience of dramatic environmental change. It has a time dimension encompassing, for example, historical marginalization of certain cultural groups, stresses about whose interests are served by decisions made today, and expectations and fears about future impacts. The challenge is capturing these effects and identifying their sources in a rigorous and compelling way within the time and resource constraints of today's project proposals and regulations. We'll now move into a question and answer format where you write your questions into the Q&A box field on the web platform. And let me see, and certain questions are being prioritized by members of the team. Those questions we don't get to today, we'll consider in formulating a possible future webinar, as well as future training and publications. In responding to questions, the presenters you just heard will be joined by Catherine Fairbairn, a Senior Environmental Assessment Advisor at the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board in Northern Canada, with experience in mining, infrastructure, and energy projects. Ruari Carthew is a social impact assessment consultant based in Sweden with projects addressing impacts and community well-being among Indigenous groups in Canada. And Eden Klein addresses psychosocial impacts in Canadian First Nations groups as an environmental planner for the consultancy Narratives Incorporated. So what would be great is if everybody on the team could turn on your cameras and your microphones, and then I'll wait for somebody to, Catherine and Ruari, you're going to highlight a certain question that we should attack first.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I just need to fix my webcam, but I'll do that while we get one question underway. We had a couple in here wondering about how you establish causality, especially related to social impacts and psychosocial impacts.
Okay, so how do you establish causality? Mike, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. It certainly comes up when you testify at trial. So I've actually been on the hot seat on this question many times in the past. But let me start out by telling a very quick story. When I finished doing my first large study, which was in Jackson Township, New Jersey, of the impacts of water contamination from the municipal landfill, I discovered that a famous environmental sociologist who had been a long-time friend of mine, Adeline Gordon-Levine, who did crucial work on Love Canal, was vacationing just a few miles away from where I was working. And so we ended up sitting for a day on the beach and comparing notes from her work and my work. And what we discovered as we went down a list, I basically just read out my notes, was that at point after point after point, what I had seen in Jackson, she had seen in Love Canal. And I had been in Love Canal as well. But there seemed to be a high degree of interaction between these results. They were talking about the same dynamics occurring in different communities, which experienced different events. And that began from the beginning to give me a lot of confidence that what I was seeing in the work that I was doing might be applicable to other cases. And I have always looked to see if that happens. The issue of causality in these situations, sometimes one is able to use the kind of statistical causality that science generally employs. But when you're doing qualitative research, and with a lot of these events, there isn't really an opportunity to use statistical causality. When it can be used, it's good, and it should be used. But lots of times what you have to do when you get into a community and you really begin to communicate with people and you begin to really look at what has changed in their context, what is the turbulence, what is really driving the impacts, and you see how people respond to it. You're not just talking to them about it, but you're seeing the response. You end up with what I call logical causality, which is a causality that just, it makes sense. It's something that wasn't there before, it's there now, and it can be explained in terms of the changes that have occurred. I found that idea to work very effectively. I've seen it stand up in administrative law and in court cases. And I think it's a kind of a necessary framework to think about when we're dealing with the kind of psychosocial impacts that we need to confront.
Who would like to add to that? One more comment.
Yeah, maybe I can add something very quickly to say, causality in science is established via either longitudinal studies or experimental studies. So social impact assessment is not that much about establishing this type of causality. It is about establishing likelihoods. And, if I get a stone, a big stone, and if I have, a glass on the floor, it's likely that if I throw the stone, it will break. Will it break? If I don't throw the stone, it won't break, but if I throw it, it probably will break. How do I know it? Because of the characteristics of the materials that I have in my hands. So physicians, they can explain it to me. And that is very clear for all of us, for someone that understands human behavior and human nature, it is as clear as a stone, the impact of a stone on a glass. It comes across as clear, and it's not subjective. It is a matter of likelihoods. There is evidence, there is literature that we use, there is data that we collect, and that supports the saying, this is likely, and then there's the magnitudes, and then there is the significance, and then after that it comes all of the reflection about how you can mitigate those impacts. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. And if audience members can ask easier questions, we'll get through them more quickly. Just kidding there. But I like that question. It's two barrels. It's causality, but essentially it's about who to blame. And that's often what it comes down to. Who needs to pay for this? Yeah. Good. Another question, Catherine or Nuwari?
Sure, we had a few asking about how psychosocial impact assessment is different from other types of impact assessment. For example, a solid health impact assessment with psychosocial or mental health considerations and impacts, or a socioeconomic study that's used to look at social impacts. So I think some kind of combined question around that. If a few people could speak to that, that would be useful.
Okay, Helen, you were nodding. Go ahead.
Give that first go, and I'm sure others can add. Thanks very much for the question, those who asked it. It's a matter we've debated quite a bit among ourselves. I take it as an invitation to bring out the distinctions rather than to compartmentalize, because there's certainly been a lot of debate, and I think our feeling would be we don't want to be presenting it as so separate that another domain for people to reckon with, but as a highly important dimension. So very, very simply, it focuses on the psychological and the social, and to a degree that social impact assessment historically has often not managed to do, and I think that's partly what expertise builds a field. So get a lot of sociology, we didn't get a lot of anthropology, so we heard less about the culture. Less, despite a few battling in there very, very hard. Who's there to see it, and what issues are to bring it forth? And I do acknowledge the communities which have brought it forth. So it's a dimension of social impact assessment, but it needs that attention to how feelings, values, the psychological interact with social process, and the social process are dynamic too. Similarly with health impact assessment, it is very closely related mental. It's a dimension of health, and Aboriginal people would say it's a three-way thing with individual, collective health, country health, all interacting. So it's a dimension. I would caution that, you know, we would emphasize how people are feeling, particularly distressed. That doesn't necessarily mean going into what would be clinically judged, for instance, over a particular mental health line. So it's closely related, but it's important and distinctive enough to have its own lens on it, at risk of it being ignored, as it has been a lot down the decades that we've been developing these other fields.
Who would like to add to that?
It's closely related to environmental impact assessment, particularly if you're in an Indigenous culture, which views connections in those ways.
Yeah, so who else would like to add to that? For example, if you're doing a conscientious health impact assessment and taking into account social and psychological factors, how do you know you've gone far enough? How can you test your own work to say, no, I need to bring in another area of expertise?
Yeah, maybe I
Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly, just to say that this question, so we like to put ourselves into boxes. You know, I do health impact assessments, he does social impact assessment, but what happens often is I've seen, you know, physicians that know a lot about mental health applying general health questionnaire, for instance, which is what psychologists also do. So to look for symptoms of depression and anxiety. So, you know, sometimes people in the health impact assessment realm are doing psychosocial impact assessment according to our definitions. And sometimes, you know, people that do psychosocial impact assessments, for instance, I do psychosocial impact assessments, and sometimes I'm doing pure social impact assessment, looking at livelihoods and that type of stuff. So, you know, it's blurry, but as Ellen was saying, you know, it is, I mentioned, and we know when we're tapping, when we're looking at specific literatures, very specific literatures that come from, you know, resilience literature, Michael studies on contaminated communities. We have psychosocial impact assessment studies, so that those environmental psychology, those type of literatures. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Right.
Well, what I was going to say is not dissimilar from what you just said, Sergio. I think that an impact assessor needs to go after where the impacts are. And they can fit into lots of different categories. That isn't so much what's important. What's important is that we need to understand as impact assessors what is actually going on here. How are impacts actually occurring in this particular setting, situation, community? And whether that ends up being classified as health impact assessment or social impact assessment or psychosocial impact assessment isn't the key issue. The key issue is that we have that understanding. What I think is distinctive about PSIA is that it often pinpoints a lot of issues that are overlooked conventionally in other assessments. They don't have to be. SIA can include PSIA. It should. HIA likewise. Environmental impact assessment is actually where I've spent much of my time. It certainly should. So, but the real crucial issue here is that the art of impact assessment is about understanding where the impacts are. And there's a whole set of impacts that have historically been left out that we're trying to grab onto here, that are the impacts that are most important often to the people who receive the adverse impacts.
Okay, great. Next question is anyone aware of evidence or cases where free, prior, and informed consent has been used or followed, and if there were benefits? And Catherine, Ruari, and Jeffrey, what might you say about this?
I can say a little bit, and then others are welcome to chime in. But I think many practitioners, and certainly I've seen it in Canada, are starting to use more of the logic and methodologies of psychosocial impact assessment in considering Indigenous concerns and issues in large development projects. And it's a method that leads well to considering the challenges that are faced by individuals that have a very strong connection to the land that's tied to their own personal identity and connection to the rest of their community and where they're coming from, and the challenges that are sort of physically and mentally felt by that individual and those communities when the environment is affected. And Michael mentioned, and others have mentioned, how one of the strengths of PSIA is that it can link a variety of sort of impacts together, and that's the case. What I have seen working with various Indigenous communities is that you're able to get that logical causality, as Michael framed it, and sort of saying, well, these issues and these stressors, they add up and they make a difference, and they do have an actual impact on people that you might not quantify it in terms of this has a X impact, but you can say these stressors add up, and so something should be done to manage those stressors and help build resilience with those communities. So as far as actual case studies, I think that's harder to come by because it is developing. There are a number of environmental assessments where you might be able to find some of that, and then there are some consulting groups that are using methodologies. I know where Eden works in this panel. Her group, Narratives, does some work with Indigenous groups that incorporate some of this material. So there is a growing body of work and practitioners working with Indigenous communities that I think are turning to PSIA as a helpful tool.
Catherine or Jeffrey?
Go for it, Catherine.
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know. I feel like Eden might be able to point us to a study that she presented on at the IAIA conference last year. But I also, I guess, would just, I think there's some in the jurisdiction that I work in the Mackenzie Valley of the Northwest Territories. It's not as formally maybe approached as sort of using FPIC specifically, but there's settled land claims and self-government, for example, with the Clecho government. So one of the recent environmental assessments that we did for the Clecho All-Season Highway, they were actually one of the decision makers. And so in that way, they could have veto power, and that they got to sort of approve the decision at the end of the day. And so that might be one thing to look at. And then I guess Jeffrey or Eden.
I can throw in a little Will. I don't have direct cases, but it's interesting that the notion of consent, which I deal with a lot in one of my other fields, does sort of imply saying yes or no to a particular proposition. I'd like to put forward the reframing potential here of making offers and also putting proposals. Let's do it this way. I was aware actually quite long ago when I was early involved in IAIA, I used to hear quite a number of cases from North America. I think it was USA rather than Canada, if not both, but where there were issues of waste disposal, locations being needed for waste disposal, and rather than putting it on communities, particular communities, to say yes or no, the offer with some pretty generous compensation was put out there, and whichever authorities were doing it were actually waiting for communities. It was probably local governments, and I hope they brought the rest of their communities along with them, actually putting their hands up to say, yes, actually we're willing to host this on certain terms to be negotiated. So there are ways of going about it, particularly I think where the location options are somewhat open-ended. It's not like a mine that's there or not there, yes or no. Obviously, there's a geology involved in waste facilities, but it's an important issue that we can be working a lot more with. My own feeling is that the more control and the better the people have been approached with greater respect, with greater degree of choice, certainly I think that it ameliorates the potential impacts as opposed to just being told this is happening to you, this is happening to your land.
Right. Can I add another dimension to this? As what leapt to mind for me was the notion of free, prior, informed consent about the manner of impact assessment, kind of looking for things like Indigenous-led impact assessment or community co-design. And there's a notion that that can potentially lead to a request for psychosocial impact assessment, because that's their lived experience and that's what they would like to have the impact assessment address. And we're seeing some of that in First Nations groups in Canada.
And it's what Woolman did those years ago.
Yep. Yeah.
Will, if I can add very quickly,
Yeah.
So no experience with free, prior, informed consent, but what I can say is that this is a tool that opens up a conversation about consent, and it's the concept of consent. It's a very powerful and very interesting one. And if again we can go to the literature from psychology on consent into, for instance, romantic relationships, and there is a lot there to learn. Namely, that consent, it's not given once and then you stay with the consent forever. Consent needs to be renovated. Consent needs to be given in a very specific set of conditions where people are aware, conscious, willing. So this opens up a very powerful conversation, and absolutely that psychology literature as a big chunk of references to help to that.
Yeah, let me hop in on what Sergio said. Coming back to Helen's example, I actually know that case study in Canada that you were referring to quite well. Upon further look, a community that volunteered to take a hazardous waste disposal site, yes, the officials of the community concerned about ratables volunteered to get the money that would come with accepting that site. But the neighbors who had to live near the site were a minority in the community. They didn't have the power. And so the consent that was given was not given by them. And the impacts were, borne by them. So it's not such a simple thing, this idea of consent by whom, and Sergio's point about you might consent to something up front because your image of what is going to happen largely shaped by the applicant who's telling you, oh, it's going to be safe, it's going to be fine, no problems. But once you start experiencing problems and you start doubting whether it's safe, all bets are off on that consent. And so I think it's a slippery concept.
And
Good.
if I could maybe just add,
Go for it.
just sort of to double down on that point, if you imagine there's a population of communities and 5 of them consent to this waste disposal, and 50 of them don't, you say, great, we have our 5 communities that have consented, but then you realize that these 5 communities are the poorest and the most sort of socioeconomically distressed 5 communities that there are in the population, and then it sort of begs the question, is this actually, a sort of willful consent on their part, or is it actually much more complicated than that? But I do think like this idea of consent and also from the impact assessor perspective, and sort of human subjects research perspective, the idea behind consent is, I think, is to ameliorate some of these psychosocial impacts and to give people a sense of control, and that they're not being taken advantage of by the assessor or by the project developer or the decision maker. And so I think it's an important aspect of the assessment process as well.
So we're reaching the end of the hour, and what I'd like to do is a quick once around the group related to a couple of questions that have been asked through the Q&A function. And that is, you're doing, let's say, a social impact assessment, and you realize it's getting into psychosocial territory. What's your one piece of advice? What should an audience member do if they find that's happening? So if you can each come up with a couple of sentences on that, and we'll go around the whole group.
Well, I would say that if that happens, that's an opportunity, not a problem. And it gives you a chance to kind of crack open what the real dynamics are in the community in a way that's much deeper, I would argue, than you're going to find in a conventional SIA. And so I would embrace that opportunity. If you need help to do it, you find the help. But I think it's a great way to actually do an even more in-depth study.
Okay, embrace the opportunity. Helen, what would you say?
Oh, echo Mike, and it means being, open to building your team as required. And that, of course, means we're going to need a lot more capacity for those people to be available, and for existing impact assessors who are comfortable in the health or the social impact assessment, to also be doing what they can to expand the outlook. Because I think a lot of the work, it doesn't always need a psychologist. That helps. It's very interpretive. It's being able to see what's there in what people are saying, and read those feelings. I speak with some health impact assessors who simply could not see the environmental side in all the interviews to one colleague, and I could think, there. People are talking about their relationships with the environment. Oh, so we need to be open-minded to it, willing to bring on team members, and also willing to learn and expand, observe ourselves.
But build the team, learn and expand. Catherine, 2 sentences, what would you say?
Well, echoing also, I think what Michael and Helen have touched on, I thought immediately, right away, listen and delve in. That is kind of gold, right? That's when you're actually getting at a lot of the impacts that people are going to experience and that they're worried about. So a lot of psychosocial impacts are very interconnected, and it can be a bit of a web or network. So really follow those threads and look at the whole holistic picture to try to get a sense of what people are telling you and the impacts that they think they'll experience.
Listen, delve in, follow the threads, get the picture. Sergio, a couple of sentences.
Yeah, I would give a step back and say, you know, when is that you might be needing a psychosocial impact assessment lens? It's not what will you do, it's when, what are the seeds for thinking, well, I might need this. And the seeds are, you know, when you are in entrenched conflicts, maybe staff, it's an entrenched conflict with the communities, maybe the communities with himself, maybe it's your team that is running an impact assessment that is in entrenched conflict. When you start to scapegoating, you know, the blame for things not going our way is this person or that community or that small group. Or when you are, you know, when you sense a frustration, whenever you get to the communities and you can't get the job done, there is where a lens, a psychosocial lens might be needed. So it won't be intuitive, but if you think about it, actually, it's really easy. It's getting difficult to get the job done, the impact assessment done.
Okay, when it gets difficult to get the job done, conflicts of interest, scapegoating, frustration, then that's when you take the psychosocial lens. Rory, 2 sentences.
The number of sentences are getting lower. I think for me, I think psychosocial impact assessments are very valuable when you're coming into situations where there's a lot of legacy challenges, trauma, potentially a lack of faith in the system. And I think it's very helpful for understanding what effects those larger stressors have had on both individual and community capacities, and understanding that you can get to a point where you're able to maybe propose ways of maintaining resilience and hopefully building trust and resilience.
Okay, so when legacy challenges resilience. Good. Jeffrey, a couple of sentences.
Trying to go back to the original prompt, which I'm not sure if we've lost that thread or if it's still here, but I think from a practical standpoint, from an assessor standpoint, I mean, I would treat it like any other sort of range of impacts. You know, maybe you're doing an assessment on impacts of a community, and you realize that there's all these dynamics going on that you don't have the expertise for, maybe around gender or indigenous groups, or maybe health, or maybe it's, you know, water quality or whatever it is, and you realize you don't have that you need to go and seek out additional expertise or additional resources. And I think the goal of this group and this webinar is to add PSIA as one of these things that you should be sort of keeping an eye out for. And if it turns out that it may be too far afield for your particular expertise or experience, that, you know, to go out and find that, just as you might for any other type of impact. And I think that was only 2 sentences, right, Will?
Right, yeah, okay. So in the impacts, keep an eye out for psychosocial impacts. If you need help, go find help. So we've now completed our scheduled time and then a few more minutes with lots more to discuss.
Well, Eden managed to get her camera and audio
okay,
working.
Very good. Your 2 sentences, go for it.
Yeah, apologies, having few technical difficulties here, but I would just, I'd really echo Rory there in terms of whenever there's a legacy of trauma, I feel like that's an especially important indicator here for when psychosocial impact assessment can be especially valuable. But I would also just offer, anytime that you're trying to conduct a more holistic assessment and trying to capture the many, many different factors that make up identity, then it is often a really, really valuable tool in that space.
Okay, legacy of trauma, more holistic assessment, factors that affect identity. Okay, now I'll do my concluding 3 sentences. Lots more to discuss. Look for a more advanced webinar on this topic in the coming year. Then there's our group's paper session chaired by Helen Ross at the IAIA conference in May in Bologna. And just before that conference will be a workshop on psychological aspects of social impact assessment led by Sergio Moreira. So we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you all. Keisha back here. So thank you to Will, Sergio, Michael, Helen, Jeffrey, Eden, Catherine, and Rory for the great presentation and discussion. Obviously, you all got to see that, but you did not see all the work behind the scenes that they've all done in preparation for this webinar and during the live broadcast. So just thank you all. It was such a great webinar. So on that note, let's keep talking. If there are any things that you want to share that you heard today, you can see our socials and hashtags on the screen. In one moment, I'll pull that up. And if you are an IAIA member, feel free to also post something on the Hub, which is our online community. Just a reminder that in a day or two, you'll be receiving the live recording via an email, which will also include the slides and the other handouts, which include the fast tips on psychosocial impact assessment, as well as that contact information sheet I mentioned. So there were a ton of questions that we were not able to get to just due to time today. So if you have a question that's just burning in your mind and you would like to get in touch with the presenter, you can find their contact information there. And even if you're watching this on demand, if you just scroll down on the page and you can see where you can download the slides, you can also download the contact information sheet there as well. So feel free to get in touch with them and they will get back to you. One last thing is, as you leave here today, you'll also be prompted to fill out our survey, and we would love to get your feedback. There's a few questions on there, but one specifically asking about future topics you'd like to hear. So please let me know if there's something that you would like to hear. As Will mentioned, if there's interest in further follow-up webinars on this topic, even just to get some of those questions answered too, please let me know and we will love to facilitate that for you. So a final thanks to all of you who joined. We know your time is valuable and you spent it here with us today, and we are very grateful for that. So everyone, have a great day and we'll see you next time.
Okay.